One of the things that we teach in the Air Club Albatross Ridge Training Program is below ridgetop recovery. I would like to preface this discussion by saying that as a beginner, you really shouldn't find yourself in this kind of situation. You really should never get substantially below ridgetop. You really should try to maintain at least 150 feet above the crest at 50 miles an hour in 126 best glide speed if you can. If you could be a little bit lower and faster. You could be, say, going 65, 70, 50, 75 feet above the trees if you'd like to, but you never should be down here because it's so weak. And that goes into the discussion of how and why would you ever find yourself in a situation like this, either here or elsewhere. So there are basically two ways in which we find ourselves below the top of the ridge. One is because the ridge is too weak, and we start settling down lower and lower and lower. And in that kind of case, this is a very dangerous place to be. You should be leaving for a landing option if you're, as you settle down lower than 150 feet, going slower than 50 miles an hour. But the second way we find ourselves below the top of the mountain is if we are coming from elsewhere on a day, say that it's working reasonably, but then we kind of misjudged and got to the ridge a bit low. This will happen, for instance, if you thermal up off the ridge and go upwind, or in the future if you are trying to do a transition, say crossing the Delaware Water Gap or Wind Gap or something like that, and you're coming around the corner and you find a lot of sink, and then you sink below the top of the mountain, even though the wind is blowing. Again, I would like to emphasize that as a beginner, that you should give yourself ample margin and altitude such that you don't go and sink below the top of the mountain and have to recover in this fashion. That said, we do like to go and discuss this and demonstrate it to give a better understanding as to how the ridge band works, and so that you're equipped with the knowledge that should you find yourself in a tricky situation, that you know what to do. And so this kind of leads into discussion of how does the ridge work below the top of the mountain. It's highly variable, so it really depends on what the wind is doing and what the mountain is like. So what ends up happening below the top of the mountain is, well, sometimes the wind is quite different a couple hundred feet below. And so, for instance, think about the Delaware River Valley here. Well, if the wind is, say, coming in at a 45-degree angle, you don't even want to be all that close to ridgetop anyway, because it gets really violent and it doesn't work all that great. But below ridgetop, pretty quickly you might find that the wind is funneling down the valley between these two mountains rather than going over the top of the mountain. So it might not work hardly at all once you get a couple hundred feet below ridgetop. The other thing that can happen is, particularly on the southeast side, the wind might not even be strong enough. So the wind at ridgetop may be 12, 13 knots, and that might be working nicely, but then you get 100 feet below, and there's hardly any wind at all. And so you might find that you get 100 feet below and there's no wind there. But on a day when it's blowing pretty nicely and the wind direction is pretty perpendicular, you can normally get 100, 200 feet, a third of the way, sometimes even half of the way below the top of the mountain, and you can still recover. But again, this is you don't ever want to bank on that. And the other thing is, it also is highly dependent on the shape of the mountain. So in this case, we're down to 1,350 feet below. It's MSL, and the top of the mountain is about 1,600 feet. This is the highest part of the mountain. And you could tell that there's a pretty nice slope here. But other mountains, once you get 100, 200 feet below ridgetop, well, they flatten out a lot, and then at that point, you're even if the wind is blowing reasonably, well, the angle is just not there to push the wind up sufficiently for you to climb up on it anymore. But in any case, should you decide to give it a try, that there's a couple things you really need to know. The first is, it is absolutely critical to maintain your airspeed. And it's very, very, very easy to pull back, slow down, slow down, slow down, because you got this big mountain next to you that you're not climbing on. And when you are low near the mountain like this, you have to maintain at least best glide speed. And the 126 is going to be about 45 knots, which is right about where we're at. That's the absolute minimum here. The second thing is, even if the ridge is working below ridgetop, it oftentimes is considerably weaker than, say, at the sweet spot at the crest. So you might find on a given day that you might be kind of limping along at, say, climbing at 1 knot as you do this. Next, you may encounter quite a bit of turbulence and a thermal and things like that, and you have to be very, very careful not to let it push you into the mountain or, maneuver you in a way that you're not happy about. So you got to be really on top of the controls, be ready to push off the mountain. And if should it get weaker yet, basically at any time you should be ready to push away off the ridge, go to the right. So if you hit a little bit of sink and you start settling down onto the trees, you should be pushing to the right. And basically kind of flushing yourself off the mountain until you get a little bit of a gust, then pushing yourself back on. If all of these things sound scary and and dicey, that's because they are. And being low and slow, up close to the mountain in gusty conditions, trying to do this kind of stuff is not an advisable place to be. However, at some point, you will probably encounter the situation. Certainly not as a rank beginner. You do not want to be doing these kinds of things in your first dozen ridge flights, but we want you to understand the technique so that if you're ever in a bind, or in the future if you just happen to put yourself into the situation, that you have some degree of an awareness of what to do. So anyway, we're going to come into the mountain at 45 knots. We are going to expect the wind to be drifting us in, so we want to come in at an obtuse angle. So you don't want to come in at a sharply against the mountain, because you're not going very fast, and then you might not be able to turn in time. We've actually had a pilot that was on purpose doing a low notch because he was trying to do a diamond climb. He got himself very low below ridgetop, and he then he aimed at the mountain at a 90-degree angle, and then he turned and he just smacked into the mountain because he didn't time the turn right. So we want to come in at a at a kind of a flat angle into the ridge, join the mountain, keep our airspeed at 45 knots, and then ride the lift up. Here we go. So we're going to turn on in. We're going to keep our airspeed at 45 knots. As we do this, we're not going to turn. We're just going to go and ride our way right up the ridge. And you have to, and if you're below ridgetop, I mean, you have to really tuck it in. The ridge doesn't work all that well. That ridge band gets really right square with the trees. And we're climbing at about 1 knot or so. Do not be tempted to turn. If you turn and it doesn't work out for you and you lose 50 feet in the turn, there's a good chance that you'll drop down into a band that's working even worse, and then you're going to get yourself in even more trouble. So oftentimes you just gotta have to buckle up and just keep your just keep going. If you do find a thermal and it gets solid, then you can try an S-turn. But again, you have to be, in this case, extremely on top of your airspeed and coordination. You are really close up against the ridge. Alright, and that, folks, is how you recover from below ridgetop. Again, I would like to strongly emphasize that you should not be in that kind of situation as a beginner. There's no reason to put yourself at 1,350 feet below ridgetop, at the couple hundred feet below ridgetop by the upper reservoir like that. But should you ever find yourself in a situation in the future where you are a little bit below ridgetop, and you expect the ridge to be working, nice, a nice solid wind. That is how you go about dealing with the recovery.